Welcome everyone to the session. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about consent today, and in particular thinking about some different perspectives on consent. So one of the, I think, really interesting things about this topic is that there are so many different ways that you can look at it. So I will be talking about how to hear no from the perspective of preventing sexual harm. And then I'm going to pass you over to Holly, as Sarah said, who's going to be talking about how to hear yes and positive consent. Okay, so just to have a little bit of a warning, which I think is important when we talk about these topics, that we are going to be thinking about consent, so obviously thinking about some elements of sexual violence. We'll be looking, for example, at the definition of sexual assault and how consent fits into that. So just to be mindful of that ahead of this, and just to, if you feel that you need to sort of mute your mic or step out at any point, just to sort of be aware of that from a self-care perspective. Okay, so let's start by thinking about something that has just happened in the last couple of days. This is a story that has made the news in the last couple of days, where a streamer in the US, who's actually the son of a rapper Ice-T, he has gone on this live stream and was on the live stream with this particular Twitcher, I believe is the phrase, that they were streaming on Twitch, and he was pretending to play with her hair, and then at one point he then pulls a pair of scissors out that he had tucked up his sleeve, and he cut off part of her hair. And this happened online, and he did it as a prank. What we can see on the slide is on the right-hand side is her video that she then sort of put out afterwards, saying she is really sort of not happy about this. Why was this such a problem? Why was it such a problem that he cut her hair? One of the main issues, and one of the main reasons that it was really positive to see people kind of highlighting this as an issue, is the issue of consent. He did it without her consent. He's not allowed to cut her hair. He's not allowed to choose what her hair looks like, how short her hair is. That's not a prank. A prank should not be something where someone lacks consent. So when we think about what consent actually means, it's about that notion of agreeing to something, engaging in behaviour, and you know what you are agreeing to. Consent in this situation would look like her saying, yeah, that's fine, you can cut off a bit of my hair for this video and we'll make it look like a joke. That would have been consent. But she didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't agree to it, so she didn't consent. So he didn't even kind of seek her yes or no. He just did it as a prank where she had no idea beforehand. So if we start to think about this notion of seeking a yes or sort of seeing if it's a no, we can look at the phrase that's become increasingly popular now about shooting your shot. You must take a chance. You must shoot your shot. You must, here's how you try and start a relationship with somebody. And one of the most popular websites for this, and the sites that will come up at the top of any Google search, if you look at, how to shoot your shot, is the site we see on here, which is a bit from the Wiki Relationships, and it has been looked at many hundreds of thousands of times. And it gives particularly males instruction for how to shoot your shot, how to kind of try and engage with females. So it gives lots of advice on how to approach a girl. Wait till she's alone. Say something about her. Say, oh, why do you have to be so perfect? Is the example it gives. Explain to her that you've looked at her social media and that you think you would actually be a great match, that she should go out with you. Your next step must be to talk about what she's wearing. Your next step is about share something vulnerable about yourself, so you're opening up to her. The steps are now do this, now tell her this and tell her this and tell her this. What we don't see is check if she actually wants you to, because your very first step is saying find a girl who's on her own and then go up and just start talking at her. And this website says, if you do this, the girl will be impressed with your boldness. She will be impressed with your confidence and your bravery, and therefore she'll be so impressed that she will absolutely say, yes, great, I want to go out with you, start a relationship with you, whatever it may be. What's worrying is what is missing from this very popular website and set of instructions, as it were, is what if she says no? How do we check for that no, and how do they hear that no? And the only time looking for a no is referenced in this website is towards the end when they sort of point out step 10 of 11. She might say no, but they say don't worry about that, because even if she says no, that's just an opportunity for you to try again. Don't worry, don't get, don't start to feel like disappointed, because it's fine, because you can just try again. If we think of movies like The Graduate, granted quite an old movie, but that trope of the idea of if she rejects you, just keep trying again. That's resilience. And then eventually you will get the girl if you keep trying. But actually all that is just refusing to hear when someone is saying no. So when we think about consent, we're really thinking about that permission to allow something to happen. Say, yes, I am agreeing to do this, and I know what I'm agreeing to, and consent is actually being able to convey and communicate that yes or that no. So it's really important that consent is about that communication. So when we think about that in the context of sexual consent, then we start to think about consenting to and agreeing to engaging in sexual behaviours or behaviours within a sexual context. So when we look at legal definitions around consent and the way it's used in the Sexual Offences Act of 2003, then it's very much defined as an agreement that's made by choice. So someone agrees by choice to engage in a particular behaviour, and there needs to be two key things here: freedom and capacity to make the choice. So they need to be free. They need not to be coerced or persuaded or being threatened. They're free to make that choice, and there's the option to say no, and there'll be no consequence. So if they're free to make the choice, great. If they have capacity to make the choice, they understand what choice they're making, what they're being asked to do. They're not incapacitated in some way, perhaps being by being very intoxicated through drugs or alcohol. If someone is asleep, they don't have capacity to consent. If someone is passed out and they're unconscious, they don't have capacity to give consent. So when we think about that choice, someone is making a choice to behave in a certain way, they are communicating that choice, and they have the freedom and the capacity to make that choice. And when we're looking to see if that choice existed and that consent was given and that agreement was reached, then it's really important to note that someone does not have to have physically resisted in order to prove a lack of consent. It's not just a case of, did you say no? Did you fight back? Someone who's asleep or unconscious can't say no, can't fight back. So it's a bit more than just hearing that word no. It's about being able to read behaviours, read contexts and situations to recognise when there is a no, and more importantly, I think when there is the absence of a clear yes, because that strong, enthusiastic yes is what you need to hear. And we'll be hearing from Holly shortly about how you can communicate that strong, clear yes. So here's some examples of where individuals would be unlikely to have given consent. If they were subjected to threats or fear of serious harm, then they're being coerced, aren't they? So they don't have the freedom to consent. If they're unconscious, drugged, or abducted, they don't have capacity to consent. Supposing someone is unable to communicate due to a physical disability, so that person is non-verbal, you would not want them in a situation where they said, well, they didn't say no. Well, of course they didn't say no, because they didn't have the capacity to communicate the choice in the way that we are making the assumption they would. So we need to be really careful about, has someone made the choice? Have they had the agency to do that? Have they had the freedom and the capacity? And what did it look like in that particular context? So how does that notion of consent fit in with the legislation around sexual violence? So in order to look at that, we can look at an example of one of the offences that's laid out in the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And essentially, this particular piece of legislation, the Sexual Offences Act 2003, is like a checklist. It's saying if we want to charge somebody with, in this case, sexual assault, they have to have met each of the criteria. If they've only met, say, 3 out of the 4 criteria, we cannot charge them with sexual assault. And in this way, we ensure consistency in what we label as offences. So we know that if someone behaves in a certain way in Manchester or London, we are going to use exactly the same criteria for whether they should be charged with sexual assault as whether it happened in Birmingham or whether it happened in Newcastle. So it gives us that consistency. So let's think about how the notion of consent fits into the Sexual Offences Act. So a person commits an offence if they intentionally touch another person. So that's really important, that word intentionally. They meant to do it. This is not someone accidentally brushing against a person, falling over in the street and, falling onto someone. It's about that intention to touch. And of course, it's quite difficult sometimes to prove someone's intention, isn't it? So we have to look at the context. And in addition to intentional touching, the touching is sexual. And we determine that by what was touched, who was touched, the context of the situation. Now we get to our consent criteria. Person B, the person who was touched, does not consent to the touching. And we might assume that that is where it would stop. That person doesn't consent. But the legislation, in order to charge for that offence, we have to have person B not consenting, but also person A does not reasonably believe that person B consents. So the law actually takes into account what someone believes is happening. Do you think you had consent? How do we know if a person thinks they have consent? And make sure it's a reasonable belief of consent, not just a belief. Because someone could say they were looking at me across the room and I could tell they were up for it. That person might have a belief of consent, but that is not a reasonable belief of consent. Someone might argue they had a reasonable belief of consent if they had spent the evening with somebody beforehand and that person had become intoxicated and they had not realised how intoxicated that person was and they thought that person was still able to consent. In that situation, our person B can't consent, but our person A reasonably believed they had consent, so they genuinely thought they had consent. So it's not only important about whether the agreement and permission was in place, but it's about what did people think was happening. So it really emphasizes the importance of being able to hear that no and recognize that behavior and recognize when someone is saying a clear yes and when actually they are saying no or they're not acting in a way that is showing that clear yes. So we think again about our freedom and capacity, someone who's unconscious, someone who's very intoxicated. So in the Sexual Offences Act of 2003, it says whether a belief is reasonable is informed by looking at all the circumstances of what happened, including what steps person A took to ascertain whether person B consents. So what did you do to find out if they consented? What steps did you take to check if they consented? So that's really important to think about their intention. Did you hear that no? Was that no said, shown, indicated, and you ignored it? Or was it about the absence of a yes? That context lets us understand what happens. So let's think about a particular example of Eve and Will. Eve and Will meet on a night out. They have a good time together and have several drinks. As they head home, they kiss and Eve starts to ask if she can go to Will's room. He agrees, but says he's too drunk to do anything and just wants to sleep. She agrees. When they get there, Will passes out on the bed. Eve removes his trousers and underwear and tries to have sex with Will, finally giving up because he's unconscious and unresponsive. Problematic? Absolutely. How do we know that Will didn't consent? He says, doesn't want to do anything, he just wants to sleep. That's a clear indication that he is saying no. Now, Eve has not heard that no, and she has continued anyway. So, is this sexual assault? We know that they didn't actually have sex because he was unconscious and unresponsive, and she did not. That act was not completed. So, we start looking at sexual assault. Was it sexual assault? Let's look at our definition. Did she intentionally touch him? Yes. Was the touching sexual? Yes. Did he consent to the touching? No, because he told her beforehand that he did not want to do that and he just wanted to sleep. Did she have a reasonable belief of consent? No, there's no way that she can say she reasonably believed that he wanted to engage in any kind of sexual act because he specifically told her, I don't want to do that, I just want to sleep. So she didn't hear his no. And what we can sometimes hear is this idea of, oh, a person is saying no, but really they mean yes. No, unless a person is explicitly, absolutely, confidently saying yes and enthusiastically saying yes, assume it's a no. Hear that no, respect that no. Because what we have here is a situation where Eve hasn't actually respected that. She hasn't heard that no. And as a result of that, we have a sexual assault taking place. So when we think about this idea of, some people they're saying no, but they really mean yes. There is an abundance of YouTube videos, unfortunately, about, how to know if a woman is really saying yes, when actually it sounds like she's saying no. And here's how to get around that. And a lot of YouTube videos focusing on, oh, women just want to be pursued. And that's why they say no when they mean yes. No. We have to hear that no, don't we? We have to hear that no and respect that no. And the research tells us the reality is it's actually the other way around. People are actually more likely to say yes when they mean no, because they're not sure how to say that no and how to put that across. Or maybe they're not sure that will be heard or respected. So there was an NUS study done back in 2011, and 8% of respondents to the survey said they had sexual intercourse when they didn't want to because they were or felt unable to say no. So what do they do if they're not sure in that situation how to say no? That's something we can help with in university consent campaigns, for example, for NUS students. But it's also something about having some strategies in place, having specific phrases to use to be able to convey that no. But that also relies on the other person hearing that no, respecting that no, and saying, okay, this person doesn't want to do it. So what's an example of what it looks like in that situation when that no isn't heard and maybe isn't respected? So Jack and Jess have been friends for a few weeks and have been out on their first date together. At the end of the night, Jack seems to expect that Jess will go back to his room and have sex. When Jess said she's not sure she wants to, Jack said he can't see their relationship progressing if she isn't up for having a good time. Jess is afraid of losing him and agrees to have sex with him. Problematic? Absolutely. Because now we're seeing coercion, aren't we? We go back to thinking about freedom and capacity. And this is affecting the notion of freedom, isn't it? She is being coerced. She is being persuaded. She said very clearly, she's not sure she wants to. In this situation, what we want ideally is for Jack to hear that no and say, okay, fair enough, doesn't want to, not a problem. No, Jack is allowed to feel all sorts of things in this situation. He's allowed to feel disappointed, he's allowed to feel angry, he's allowed to feel all those sort of things. What he's not allowed to do is to try and keep on convincing her and persuading her to have sex with him, because that's problematic, isn't it? That is not hearing her no, and that's trying to persuade her to do something that she's already said she doesn't really want to do. So how can we take that notion of, but I'm just trying to persuade someone, how can we take that and how can we change that into someone like Jack actively hearing that no? Well, we can look at examples of scenarios that kind of mirror what we're looking at. So I think a lot of people have seen the cup of tea video, which is, I think, is really good in lots of ways about sort of showing a particular options and different things that can happen with consent. But for the purposes of these key messages about hearing that no, I think we need to pull out some really important parts of that. So having done something once doesn't mean you've permission to do it again. So just because someone bored your car and you let them and they say that was absolutely fine, just like we see in a wee cartoon, you can't expect them to just take it again whenever they want. And you say, well, what are you doing? I didn't say you could have it now. Oh, but you let me have it last week. Doesn't matter. Consent needs to happen each and every time. And that matches up whether we are borrowing someone's car or whether we are engaging in sexual activity. So it's that sexual consent is important to gain it every single time. And it doesn't matter if someone said yes last week, last month, last year, last night. Still got to check again. If you wouldn't do something while a person was unconscious, like as we see in the little cartoon, getting a tattoo, even if they said they wanted it, you still wouldn't do it without checking you had their consent. So in our little cartoon here, a person saying, yeah, I really want to get this particular tattoo, and then they're unconscious. And then so the person gives them the tattoo and they wake up and they say, well, what have you done? She said, yeah, but you said you were going to get it. But that doesn't matter. I didn't ask you to give it to me now, certainly not while I was unconscious. Maybe a bit of a daft example, but the point remains that it doesn't matter what someone said or did, or, oh, I think I might like to do that earlier. We have to check each and every time, particularly if they're unconscious. We can't assume this person's unconscious, so I'm going to make a judgment about what they would or would not like to do and engage in. And then I think this is really important. You don't know anyone, anything. It doesn't matter if someone's bought you dinner, a drink, whatever it might be. No one owes anybody else that, whether that be sexual activity, whether that be going home with them, whatever it may be. Just because someone has bought dinner, a drink, doesn't make any difference. So this idea that I have done this for you, so now you owe me, that almost sets up the scenario where someone can't say no. It's essentially saying you're not actually allowed to say no in this situation because I have done this for you. Whereas the reality, of course, is that we can all say no. We can always say no. No is always an option. You don't owe anyone anything. There's a really lovely program that was created in the US that talks about the shark cage and encourages people to develop the shark cage and this notion of that sort of self-protection. Say you're sitting in a bar and then someone says, do you want a drink? And you go, oh, no, thank you. And then they go, here's your drink. And you think, well, I didn't want a drink. I said no. And they go, well, now I've bought you a drink. You have to talk to me. Social conventions dictate a lot of people will in that situation talk to them because they'll say, well, they did buy me a drink, so now I have to talk to them. No, you didn't ask them for that. You don't owe them anything. Even if you did say yes to the drink, even if you asked them to buy you a drink, they hadn't even talked to you. Doesn't mean that you then have to go home with them, that you owe them anything. You can still always say no, and they still always have to hear that no. And the notion of the shark cage, I think, is a really nice one. It's about building up that sort of mental cage around you that's sort of, it's almost like having Teflon around you. That someone says, oh, you have to do this. No, I don't. Nope, I can stick to what I want to do and only what I want to do. And it's okay for me to say no. And I don't have to go along with what you're saying I must do, which is at the very heart of consent, isn't it? So when I've run consent workshops and healthy relationships training and bystander training over the years, people tend to come up with a range of scenarios and they say, well, we understand consent, but what if? And they give a range of scenarios. So I'm just going to give you some examples of the sort of questions that I've heard about consent. What if we have history? What if we've been in a relationship for a long time? What if we used to go out? What if we went home together last weekend? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that you can assume consent. You have to check for consent, and you also have to be prepared to hear that no. Another question, what if that person is intoxicated to the point that they can't consent because they don't have capacity? So we recognise then that they cannot give consent. great. But then I've been asked, but what about if you're super drunk too? So if you go and have a load of drinks, is that okay? No, that just means neither of you have the capacity to consent. So that is not a get out of jail free card. It's fine if they're drunk as long as I get drunk too. Absolutely not. Volta her questions around consent, around the age of consent. Supposing there's someone who is age 14, 15, but they are in an 18 plus nightclub and they've been allowed in by the bouncers. So I've been asked, well, what if you think someone might be younger or maybe too young to consent, but they are in a nightclub and it's 18 plus? Can you say, well, they were allowed in here, so it's reasonable for me to say, okay, let's just assume they're 18 and act in a way as if they're 18, even if I suspect they're younger? No, absolutely not. So we can think of all these sort of contrived situations. Oh, but what if this? But what if that? And it comes down to understanding the context of the situation. What is happening here? Do I have the freedom and the capacity to consent? Am I hearing that no? Is there an option for that person to say no without any consequence to them? And I think this really nice sort of diagram from Planned Parenthood covers a lot of these areas really well. Brings it into fast food, but that's never a bad thing. So when we talk about consent, we use the FRIES acronym. It should be freely given. So not coerced, not like Jess and Jack, where she was saying, to be honest, I don't really want to. And he's saying, well, if you're not up for a good time, then that's it. He's trying to persuade her to have sex with him. Her consent would then not be freely given. He's trying to persuade it. So freely given, reversible, so it can be changed at any time. Informed, so someone knows what they're consenting to. Enthusiastic and specific. And one of the things that seems to cause the most surprise when we talk about consent and consent workshops and the like, both at university and sort of within police and schools, is when we talk about this notion of consent being specific. Someone consents to a specific thing. So, for example, if someone consents to sex with the use of a condom, if that is then removed without their knowledge, then consent is withdrawn because they have consented to one thing and now something different is happening. So consent is that specific. And that's where it's really important, I think, to break a bit of the stigma and embarrassment about talking about some of these areas and having conversations about consent. So ultimately, what needs to happen in order to be able to hear that no? So both people involved in a situation must be able to say no if they want to with no consequences, or they can simply avoid saying yes. The key is, remember, FRIES, we're looking for that positive, enthusiastic yes. And if it's not there, that has to be recognised. Because it only works to think about, giving that positive consent and being able to say no if you want to and not engage if you want to. It only works if the other person involved is willing to hear and respect that no. So let's think of an example that happened this week. Just on Monday of this week, in fact, I think perhaps Sunday night of this week, there was a video taken at a train station down south. It was a young woman who was standing alone at the train platform, and she filmed at night a guy crossing over the tracks. He jumped on the tracks from the other side and ran across the tracks and came across to her, and he's saying, "Hi, how are you doing? I want to talk to you." And she said, "No, leave me alone. I don't want to talk to you." And he said, "Oh, come on, you've got to hear me out, hear my part." And she said, "I don't have to hear you out. I don't want to talk to you. I just, leave me alone." And he said, "Well, if you wander off, I'll just follow you." Which, of course, is quite scary, isn't it? It's nighttime, she's on her own, and she's saying, "No, leave me alone." She could not be more explicit. And yet he will not leave her alone. And it was a really difficult video to watch. And ultimately, she managed to get away from the station and get away from him. But the way she did that was another woman entered the station and she actually went and spoke to the other woman. And that other woman said, "Right, let's get you away from this situation." But then she missed her train. She doesn't get her train. She has to change her situation just because that guy doesn't hear no. So they were going to be talking about this on the radio yesterday morning, an Eddie Nestor show. So I thought, let's hear what they have to say about this. Hopefully they'll just condemn that behaviour. And what they were saying was, well, why wasn't she just more forceful in her no? Why wasn't she clearer in saying no to him? Now, first off, she was super clear in saying no to him. He just didn't hear the no. And it really emphasised the importance of not only having that no be present, but when she's saying, "I don't want to talk to you, leave me alone," not only did he refuse to hear that no, he started to get a bit angry that she was actually saying no to him. And that is something that we see again and again, unfortunately. Why might a woman not say yes? Why might a woman be scared to actually outright say no to a man who is trying to talk to them, ask them out? Now, this particular sort of piece focused on 14 women who were attacked for rejecting men, for saying that no. So what's really important when we think about consent is being able to say no, being able to think about how we actually give that no, how we can show, even if we're not able to say it, how can we show that we're not interested, we don't want that no. But then also we need to have a community and a context where we can say no safely and know that we're actually not going to experience any retaliation for it. And a great campaign around this is the Say Mate campaign that was started down by the Mayor of London a few months ago, encouraging people to speak up, be active bystanders, which is very close to my heart, and speak out. If you see your mates not respecting consent, call them out on it and tell them that they need to start hearing that no. Mate, come on, she said no, leave her alone. So we need to be able to hear no, and we need to be able to also be active bystanders around us. So what are our takeaway points? We need to have freedom and capacity to consent. We need to be looking for enthusiastic, specific, freely given consent, that consent which is reversible at any time, so we can take it away at any time. We need to recognize that unless someone is giving that enthusiastic yes, it's a no. And that no needs to be heard. And if we're not hearing that no, then we will hopefully have active bystanders around us who will say, mate, come on, hear the no. So on that point, I'm going to pass you over to Holly, who's going to be talking about how to give a very positive yes.
Thanks so much, Jill. Really fantastic to hear from you. I will just jump in and share my screen for my presentation. So hopefully you can all see that okay. Just a little bit about me. I'm a lecturer in media and culture, but I'm doing my PhD on positive sexual consent currently, but I have also already completed a master's by research on this topic too. And alongside that, wherever I can, I'm kind of participating in what I call positive consent activism. Which is what brought me to launching the Consent is Positive project. So it's partly my PhD research and partly an activism project, very much focused on promoting positive sexual consent. So it really works in tandem with the sort of work that Gill is doing, kind of looking at the other side of the coin of this issue. So my perspective very much acknowledges those issues around non-consent, assault, harassment and rape, because those are very important to acknowledge. But my focus is very much how do I say yes and how do I see yes as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to run you through a bit of past research on positive sexual consent. I'm going to look at some of the findings from my master's, and that's linking into some of the ongoing findings in my PhD as well. And then I'm going to summarise with some takeaways about good practice in positive consent, and then tell you just a little bit more about the research I'm doing at the moment and how you can support the project. So let's talk about conditions of consent. And this is, somewhat reiterating some of what Jill has already said, but I think it kind of sets the scene for the idea of positive consent. So the questions that we have to be asking in relation to positive consent is what must be present, exist, or be known for sexual consent to be valid? So there's kind of questions for you to ask yourself, but also questions for you to be asking of the person or people that you're with. So questions for you will be things like, what am I consenting to? So that's Jill kind of referencing the specificness of consent as well. Who am I consenting to? So there's a degree of knowledge that we have to have about the people that we are consenting to. That is a reasonable amount of knowledge we should be able to have about people we're going to be intimate with. Am I safe? And that safety can pertain to all kinds of things, the environment you're in, but also the person that you're with too. Can I not consent? So this is something, again, Jill has emphasised a lot. Is there a space for a no? And we'll come back to that some more. And then the issue of capacity. Am I able to consent? So, as we've said, talking about things like issues of intoxication, for example. And then there's questions for you to consider about the person or the people that you're with. So do they know what I want? Have I communicated clearly what my expectations are of this situation? Have I told them or communicated to them what they need to know about me and about this situation? So, you know, do they have enough knowledge to do the consenting? Are they safe as well? Because we might think we'll find ourselves in a situation that's sexually intimate where we ourselves are safe, but perhaps the person we're with might not be for many reasons. Have I made it clear that it's okay to say no, not to do any of the things that we're kind of hoping might happen? So creating the space for no, and are they capable of consent? So making an assessment of their capacity. And again, the most common example here is someone too intoxicated? So knowing the conditions of consent, I then obviously have this particular focus on positive sexual consent. And as a researcher and an activist, I really have to ask myself, I need to be able to define positive sexual consent. So what is it? Well, it's a sexually intimate interaction in which two or more people participate entirely willingly. But also, for my purposes, it's talking about the means by which this willingness is communicated, perceived, and experienced by those involved. And that process of the communication, the perception, and the experience is what I'm really interested in as a researcher, but also in terms of communicating to the wider world. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the historic research. It's not that historic, it's only from 2014, but kind of preceded the work that I've done. And I do want to add a note that's really important, that this research, much like a lot of the positive sexual consent research, has been conducted with heterosexual cisgendered individuals. So we can't necessarily assume a universal application. And I will return to the issue of kind of diversity and inclusion when we're talking about consent and when we're talking about consent research. But hopefully there are some kind of concepts that we can apply to everyone in spite of those kind of limitations. So in this research, they asked people, how do you indicate your consent? And you can see the table is kind of laid out like percentages of all responses and then broken down into women and men. So they ask, you know, the people who said, I indicate my consent using body language or non-verbal cues. And in this case, they said 10% of women, 48% of men said that. Other people say I would ask or tell my partner or use other verbal cues. That's our kind of best practice. So half of the women they spoke to said that they would use that practice, and 32% of men. Some people are saying they would use kind of a combination of them, non-verbal and verbal cues. And then, like, in the minority, some people saying I would just let it happen or not say no. And we can see that that's much more common in the women participants here. I would begin sexual activity and check to see if my partner is okay. 0 women said that, but some of the men did. And I would engage in reciprocating behaviour. Again, very limited number of people. So the other thing they asked was, how do you interpret consent from your partner? And this is where it starts to get quite interesting. So they asked the responses were my partner's body language or non-verbal cues, so the same categories. So they're saying I'm seeing consent through body language or non-verbal cues. So 30% of women, 60%, 61% of men. My partner would tell me or use other verbal cues. 28% of women, 9% of men. My partner would use a combination, slightly higher percentage there, 36 and 22. Very few people saying my partner would let it happen or not say no. So very few people are saying that they're perceiving consent through kind of an absence of a no completely. And then finally, again, a small number saying my partner would lead me on, make the first move, or begin sexual activity. And again, that kind of engaging behaviour, starting it behaviour was only identified in women. So if we start to compare these, it gets particularly interesting. So when asked, once people saying I would use body language or non-verbal cues, you can see 10% of women said that they would use body language or non-verbal cues and 48% of men. But then when we look at the other side of that, how do you interpret consent? It becomes a bit problematic, because remember that these are heterosexual couples here, or heterosexual individuals being asked this question. 61% of men saying that they would see body language and non-verbal cues, and yet only 10% of women are saying that that's how they communicate it. And equally, there's a bit of a disparity between that and men. Overall, there's a sense that it's less common than people think to use the body language and non-verbal cues, or at least it's being perceived more frequently than people are perceiving it in themselves as their behaviours. So as we saw before, 50% of women would say they would use verbal cues, or they would ask or tell their partner, and yet only 9% of men are seeing that as a common consent cue. So it's very problematic that we're kind of seeing this disparity, and it's very easy to gender this, and certainly there is a gendered issue between heterosexual interactions, but equally, I think that there is also something going on a kind of functional level about how people expect sex to proceed and how it happens between people, that behaviours are seen in one way and practiced in a different way. And that's why we really need to focus on like how to do positive consent and communicate that quite effectively and kind of get the message out about it. So we can talk a bit about what my research has found out. So this is predominantly sourced from my master's research, which I've popped a reference in down there. But as I say, it's supported by my ongoing PhD research as well. So for a start, within heterosexual relationships, the idea of men as initiators and women as gatekeepers is very much normalized. But as people become more sexually experienced, they might not be so dependent upon that. So one of the theories I work with is sexual script theory, and this is the idea that we have sort of expectations about how things will go, and we have a script for them in our heads, sort of. And here we're saying that people kind of expect that men will start and women are in the position of saying yes or no. So they are gatekeeping the kind of sexual intimacy. And the evidence suggests that as people learn more about sex, become more sexually experienced, they're not so dependent upon that idea, but also as relationships progress, they are less dependent upon that idea. So I said I would refer back to LGBTQ relationships because it's definitely an issue that, you know, the research is not sufficiently inclusive. So with this perspective, there can be an idea that perhaps we can shrug off the idea of initiator and gatekeeper because we don't have to adhere to those traditional heterosexual practices, heteronormativity, as we would say. But the reality is that that's not happening. And usually in most sexual encounters, whoever's participating, there is some sense of an initiator and a gatekeeper. And I think ultimately this is down to the fact that whatever your sexual identity, you've grown up and learned about sex in a heteronormative society, which means they are defining these roles. So people's identity and their personality traits can kind of often dictate which role they might take as initiator or gatekeeper, but they do seem to be present across relationships, irrespective of their sort of sexual identities or gender identities of the people involved. So something else which is definitely has been touched on by Gill and we know is kind of problematic is that we very often avoid explicit verbal stuff, and my findings really suggest that often we avoid explicit verbal requests for consent or responses in consent because we're a bit embarrassed and fearful of rejection. Essentially, the idea is that it's much harder to be cool about being rejected when you've said exactly what you want Whereas there's an idea that if you make a kind of a subtle indication that you were interested in doing a certain thing and that person rejects you, you can almost act like you didn't make that move or request that thing in the first place. So that is an issue that we're facing in terms of good practice, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. One thing I've noticed, which is perhaps a bit more positive, is that people are less likely to use verbal initiation and consent in early on in their relationships, but if they've been together for longer, they're much more comfortable with doing that and less worried by being rejected or indeed by rejecting their partner. Much of the people that I spoke to would be like, oh, it just happened, it just felt right, we were just both so present, and then 4 years down the line they're like, well, I don't have time for those just happen moments anymore. So things are progressing, and the context and the relationship between the people make a difference. On the plus side, in terms of this sort of lack of explicit verbal consent, is that my findings generally suggest that people are quite frequently fairly fluent in the non-verbal sexual communication of their partners. Often they can say with confidence that they experienced a mutually consenting encounter, but they're not always able to clearly talk about how that kind of went down, how it took place. And this is a really common approach, but as we know from what Gill has spoken about, this is absolutely not without risk, and it's not an ideal way of doing things. What has mitigated those risks, and this is especially the case in sort of ongoing relationships, long-term relationships, is that if an environment is created where everyone present is very confident that any form of non-consent is respected, understood, and freely communicated, it allows a little bit more space for those more nuanced, less verbally explicit expressions of positive consent, because the person who's there is going, I know that this person I'm with will let me know very quickly and very clearly if they're not happy with what's going on, and I will make them feel completely okay about that. Another kind of thing that comes up throughout the research is that conversations outside of the moment of physical intimacy, usually before or after sex, were an important site of consent negotiation for things like expectation setting, guidance, and clarification. So this is saying consent practices don't only happen in moments of sexual intimacy, and a lot of the contributions to consent can be those, kind of the after sex conversations, but also about beforehand setting expectations too. So let's have a look at the general takeaways from that research and what some good practices are. First of all, consent is an interaction. It's about two or even more people connecting and engaging with and understanding one another. When sex becomes about getting something from someone else, that is when consent becomes a major problem. So it's really important that we're not perceiving our sexual intimacy as getting something from somebody. It's about that interaction. So when sex is about mutually respecting human beings connecting, it works. And I'm not being moralistic about this. I'm not saying that all sex or all consent has to happen within these sort of long-term intimate relationships. It can be brief and without any major emotional connection, or it can be part of a lifelong deep emotional connection, or indeed anything in between. The importance there is about this mutual respect, interacting, and not feeling like you are getting something from somebody else. So good practice. So stop, slow, go. As I've said, consent only works if it's okay not to. So the safest way to make sure that everyone is okay and having fun is to remind them from the start that it's okay to stop, to slow down, or to change their minds at any time. And that's a really easy thing to do. And this is especially important in the early stages or in casual encounters when you don't know people that well. So being clear about what you want is so important as well. You're actually no more likely to get a rejection if you are clear and explicit about your desires than if you try and subtly indicate them. Being clear about what you want does show respect to the person you're interested in. Just remember, you are not seducing by stealth. You want the person you're with to know that you want them. So, saying yes. It is actually okay if your consenting cues are not explicitly verbal, as long as they are clear. I'm not expecting people to be a consent robot. It doesn't have to be super formal. There are lots of ways to clearly communicate a yes that are not necessarily saying that exact word, but clarity is important. So checking in. Consent is not a single moment. I often remember hearing that somebody tried to address the problems that we have around consent and rape and sexual assault by introducing an app where someone essentially agreed to a contract and they, signed something on a phone to say, yes, I have agreed to have sex. It's not appropriate because the consent doesn't happen in that single moment. It's an ongoing thing. And one way or another, we need to be checking in with each other and indeed ourselves. And that's especially important if the communication is non-verbal. You need to be aware of one another and making sure that everybody's continuing to enjoy themselves. So talking about sex before and after, as I've said, can be very useful. It builds intimacy and it sets expectations, but also it gives people a chance to talk about the things they liked, the things they might like to try, but also saying what their consent cues look like and all asking their partner how they felt about things, and explaining what they understood from their partner's communication. So essentially these conversations, they can give you a better literacy in your sexual partner, and you know what they want, what they like, what they enjoy, but also how they will be communicating to you. So those are my takeaways, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about my current research. So as I've said, this is part of my PhD, but it's part of a wider project called the Consent is Positive project, where I'm hoping to really get people talking about consent and how they make it work. So my research is digitally based. It's done on Teams, much like this. But what happens is I ask two people who are or have been sexually intimate to have a conversation about how it works for them. So they sit in a room together or even on two separate devices if they're in a different location. And they have a chat of any length about how they have done consent, how they communicate to one another, how they understood one another. I don't ask questions, I don't interview people, I don't do a questionnaire. I want it to be a conversation between the people who share consent, expressing how consent is functional for them and what it means, rather than me defining consent. And that is open to literally anyone who's 18 or older, whatever their relationship history, whatever their orientation, whatever their identity, everyone is welcome. And what I'm hoping to do with this is really to gather an in-depth and diverse range of stories about what positive sexual consent looks like. So I'm trying to address that gap in kind of diverse identities being included in the research. I want to get people talking about consent, promote better conversations about consent. I want to raise awareness of good practice, and ultimately I'm hoping that from the research that I do and the findings that I get, I'll be able to develop materials to support relationship and sex education, both in schools, in settings like this, and in informal settings, so communicated via social media as well. So ways you can support the project. If you feel like you could volunteer to participate in the research, that would be amazing. But also share and promote the research, encourage participation across your networks. You can engage with me on social media using the hashtag how I say yes. And you can come and find me. So the website, which is always the first point of call, is consentipospositive.co.uk. You can also find me on Instagram at Consent is Positive Project, on Twitter at Barnes-Bennetts, X, I guess. And I have a Facebook page, which is the Consent is Positive Project as well. So hopefully you have found what I've shared interesting, and I believe I'm going to stop sharing now. I believe we are now able to open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was fantastic. And also to Gill, who has been in here with me listening intently to that talk as well. Fantastic to hear how both talks complement each other as well, and some really practical strategies, Holly, there just to move things forward at the end. Really, really nice. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions for Gill or for Holly? If you want to pop your hand up, you can raise your hand and we can come to you, or you can type your question in the chat box. I guess while we're waiting for some questions, I will ask one, just because I've got the floor. Gill, if I could ask you perhaps, maybe if you could just say a little bit about some of your research maybe, and how that has built on some of the ethical dilemmas and issues that you were talking about in the first half.
Thanks, Sarah. So some of the research that I've been doing around this specific issue of consent has been focusing on student perspectives of consent, looking at what does consent mean to specific students. And it really does have that notion of, the majority of male students have said that they would seek permission, whereas the majority of female students, not all, but the majority, said it was about giving something, giving that consent. So it's very much this almost sense of a negotiated transaction. We've also looked at the impact of intoxication on that consent decision, and how some factors like intoxication, how much setting is perceived as being sexual or not, how much does that affect consent? Because within student populations, the research around the area has shown that if someone perceives himself to be in a sexual setting, such as a house party for students, for example, then the perceived need for consent in those situations seems to be reduced. So my research has been looking at some of the effects of those specific situations on perceptions of consent. And if anyone is local to the university, I know we have quite a few people online today from the university, then I am doing a talk about that specific piece of research as part of our Consent Week, which is happening on Thursday, the 9th of November. So I'll be doing that talk, quick promotion for my talk then. I'll be doing that talk at 3:15 in EEG 169. So if anyone wants to come along and hear that, and that talk is about bringing the student voice into university consent training, and the importance of not simply having a one-size-fits-all consent training, but recognising how students, both our students and students nationally, perceive consent, the factors that affect it, like intoxication, like perceived sexual setting, and then think about it in terms of this negotiated transaction, and how can we actually use that to inform our consent training to make sure that we're making it as user-friendly as possible, but also as effective as possible in this setting.
Thank you very much, Gill, and also for the effort for the next talk that you're going to do. That's brilliant. Thanks. Any other questions from any listening? I also wondered, Holly, I don't know if we actually had your contact details. I think we might have done in the blurb for the talk, but whether you wanted to post those in the chat for people that are here today, just to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I'll pop the web address in as well. And obviously people are welcome to email me if they have any questions. So yeah, I'll put that in there. Also, I am doing something with the SU's Consent Week as well. So I'm doing a positive consent workshop very much aimed at the students as well, which I think is taking place at 11:30 on the Tuesday of Consent Week. So I can't remember the room though, so I'm less prepared than Gill is. I think it's in Binion. But I think that's...
Your room, Holly, is BY1151 at 11:30 in the morning.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think that's kind of being cascaded to students over the course of this week as well. But yeah, I'll pop the website in now.
Thank you. Okay, any final thoughts or questions from anybody? I think we've got a very quiet, attentive audience this afternoon, which is lovely. Well, thank you all, everybody, for coming along this afternoon. I think if there are no more questions, we will wrap things up. So thanks again for listening, and thank you ever so much to Holly and to Gill for such a positive talk this afternoon. It's been great to learn about both strands of research. So thank you very much.